Myanmar's military blocked Facebook and other messaging services on Thursday to shut down dissent. It comes just days after they launched a coup and detained de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi.
12 months on from the military takeover and violent crackdown that followed, the country remains in turmoil. Clashes are escalating between the soldiers and newly formed People's Defense Forces, as well as some of the country's ethnic armed groups. There's no end in sight to the conflict.
In other news, witnesses say at least 40 people have been killed and dozens more injured after Myanmar's military bombed a candlelit vigil. Locals say there were multiple strikes on a village in Myanmar's Chang-U township, where locals had gathered for a Buddhist festival and to protest the ruling military junta's policies, as well as demand the release of political prisoners.
Take a peek behind the curtains, and you'll find that recording a podcast conversation is a fascinating and somewhat unique experience. In that moment, the guest and host are speaking privately, sharing their thoughts and stories just with each other. Yet, they do so knowing that their words will later reach thousands of listeners, each experiencing the conversation in their own way, shaped by their own perspectives and reflections. At Insight Myanmar podcast, we try to conjure up the image of our listeners as though you are seated here with us, a third chair at the table, so to speak, which helps us create the feel of a more intimate conversational experience. So, as you listen, we hope that you can lean into this connection and join us in exploring these stories and discover where they may take you. Welcome to the conversation. We're glad you're here. Today on Inside Myanmar podcast, we are joined by Scott Aronson, a humanitarian and conflict expert who, in the wake of Myanmar's 2021 military coup, helped to orchestrate safe houses, escape routes, and emergency lifelines for Burmese activists that found themselves immediately targeted by the junta. Scott was working with the U.S. Embassy and USAID and played a critical role in keeping civil society alive during one of the country's darkest hours. So we'll talk about what happened behind the scenes as far as it's safe to share, as well as his background leading up to here, the risks involved, and how it compares to past crises in Myanmar's turbulent history, as well as other crises that have happened in other countries for a comparative example. So with that, Scott, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and really appreciate the time you take to tell these stories that are so important during this critical time in Myanmar's history.
Thank you. So before we get into those critical days of February 1st, 2021, and the days and weeks following, I'd like to learn a little bit about yourself and have our audience have a greater appreciation of your background and the work that you were doing in Myanmar before, and then before Myanmar itself, the work that you were doing in other countries to get an understanding of what role you were in and what your capacity was when things really went south. So if you can flesh out a bit of that personal and professional background for us.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my professional career really began in the early 2000s working in Southern Africa and particularly working with the UN and other humanitarian communities in Southern Africa, working on refugee movements. And so for a long time, my career in the early days was primarily with non-governmental organizations working in conflict-affected communities or conflict areas in parts of Eastern and Southern Africa. I worked in the Darfur humanitarian crisis for nearly 4 years with both INGOs and the United Nations before moving to northern Uganda, post-LRA reconstruction work in northern Uganda, and had a specific focus on protection of civilians and gender-based violence throughout much of my time in those areas. I eventually started working with the U.S. government, USAID, the organization formerly known as the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance within USAID. And that work provided me an opportunity to oversee both conflict-affected communities, but also disaster response capabilities for the U.S. government and emergency response to natural disasters. And so I continued to work for the U.S. government for a number of years in that capacity, often supporting when the U.S. military got involved in international support mechanisms for natural disasters. So I deployed to a number of natural disasters globally when U.S. military assets were able to support the host country. An example of that would be the Nepal earthquake that took place in 2015. U.S. military assets were very helpful, particularly rotary assets for reaching remote communities. But the U.S. government used to have a very unique approach where they made sure they had a civilian dictating where those assets went and how they were incorporated into the broader humanitarian structure to make sure that the military assets were used most appropriately and effectively in an emergency response and in coordination with the host nations. So that's kind of my early background. I went to Myanmar in 2016, initially to support the transition phase from the junta and the dictatorship into the democratic transformation within the country, and was part of the U.S. government's approach to supporting the formal peace process, but also building up civil society to take on those core functions within the country that had been oppressed for so long, and helping build up their capacity and their technical knowledge, and creating platforms for collaboration between civil society groups that had been separated either by geographic distance or by ethnic diversity or religious diversity, and trying to create platforms of coordination, communication, and understanding and tolerance within those communities. And so that was what brought me to Burma in those early stages. My position was the senior conflict and governance advisor for USAID at the embassy in Yangon when the coup took place.
So thanks for that background and sharing a bit about the conflict areas that you were deployed earlier, and I think also, maybe getting to later in the conversation, the work you did through DART in Nepal and that earthquake, because I think that could be a helpful contrast in terms of what happened just recently with the earthquake in Myanmar and how the Trump administration at that time dealt with that conflict. But then first, going into your years in the transition, I mean, you came in 2016, and when you first arrived, the coup was 2021. That's 5 years in the country at a really volatile time, a really exciting time, a really dynamic time, a troubling time, all the different words we can use to describe that period. They were all happening simultaneously. And you were at the center of it in terms of the work that you were doing in supporting civil society. And so I'm curious to set the stage, if you can talk about what the objectives were of the U.S. government at that time, what it was you were charged with doing. And then if you can talk a bit about as you started to carry your mission out, the challenges you faced, as well as some of the small successes that you had along the way, as well as perhaps some of the things that were left on the table for whatever reason that weren't able to get to in that very challenging climate.
Sure, absolutely. It was a really dynamic, but also very challenging time to work in Myanmar. And the U.S. government had long had and continues to have a long history and strong relationship with the activist community and the elected government of Myanmar. Certainly, Aung San Suu Kyi's home imprisonment prior to 2012 was something that the U.S. government had long paid attention to, and really been very active in their support to Burmese activists, both along the borders, but also the Burmese activist community that was in the United States and engaging with Congress. And so the U.S. Embassy's mission, and USAID more specifically, was really to be supportive of the people's desire for a democratic country in Burma. And so there was absolutely a political context to that. And so we were involved in the formal peace process that was taking place between Aung San Suu Kyi's government as well as the military and the old Thein Sein government, in trying to ensure that it would be a collective peace that included the ethnic armed groups and civil society, recognizing that historically those groups had often been left out of many of the formal conversations that were taking place. And so the US government was actively trying to ensure that those voices were being heard. And part of my mandate was, again, focused on civil society, and particularly civil society that were working in conflict-affected communities. So my focus areas early on were Rakhine State, Shan State, and Kachin State, because those were three of the areas that continue to have active areas of conflict. And unfortunately, Rakhine became the primary area of my work early in my time in Myanmar, with the genocide that took place in 2017. And so I was very involved with a number of civil society organizations that were active in Rakhine, both within the Rakhine and the Rohingya community. And the US government, through a number of different funding mechanisms, was able to support a number of civil society organizations who were able to access the Rohingya community during the genocide, providing food, medical supplies, shelter for those that remained within Myanmar. And then I was also able to travel to Bangladesh and engage with the communities that made it to Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar, and help coordinate support through our refugee agency, through the Department of State in Bangladesh as well. So that was really a main focus area for me, but and certainly something that I will just say kind of highlights the tension that Myanmar was going through in that time. In one hand, you had this really promising opportunity for full democracy in a country that hadn't experienced that since the 40s. You had opportunities for these different ethnic communities to engage each other, not as enemies, but as collaborators working towards a democratic Myanmar. But it also kind of laid bare many of the existing tensions and challenges that these communities faced that had been oppressed by a military dictatorship, and that didn't have other avenues to solve these solutions other than violence. And so I think the Rakhine State crisis and the Rohingya genocide is one of those examples of what takes place when you live in such an oppressive society. And these transition periods can be fraught with danger if not done in a coordinated and responsible way. And you saw that tragically carry out with the Rohingya. And so it certainly brought home to me the complex dynamics that we were working with, that this was not going to be an easy or smooth transition, that the people of Myanmar had many complex feelings and grievances and challenges that they were going to be working through for generations. But there was still hope. There was still an avenue for change. It just might be longer and more challenging than we had anticipated as the international community, and was excited to get to continue to play a role with that and to really see what the different civil society groups could do, because I was able to see the best and the worst of that. I mean, I was able to see Rohingya civil society taking great risk to themselves in order to get food and supplies to those in need. And there were other members of different ethnic communities willing to help as well. So, that gave great hope even during a very dark time, which I think what was so shocking when the actual coup took place in 2021, because I really did feel like there was an avenue for hope even through the challenges.
Yeah, as you're saying all that, one of the things that's coming to mind is just the robust and dynamic quality of what U.S. funding was able to provide in all kinds of ways. And this is not to paint an idealistic or rosy picture of it. I think that if you want to peer down to the details, I'm sure there's waste or there's fat there. I'm sure there's things that weren't working as effectively, and we can get into where how this work might be benefiting the political aims of the U.S. government as well. We can get into all of that, but before doing so, I just want to give that as disclaimers that we're not trying to prop up and paint this rosy, perfect picture of how things were. But that being said, I want to contrast what you were saying with this really robust and dynamic effort of what U.S. funding was able to provide, and let us not forget this is the first Trump administration, and let us also not forget George W. Bush, Mitch McConnell, many other Republican GOP names we can reference here have been longtime supporters of the Burma democracy movement. And 2021 happens. The years after 2021, they're still very dynamic funding that's going towards helping all manner of those activists responding to this very murderous and violent military coup that takes place. Of course, where I'm building with this is that the Trump administration pulls almost all of its funding for health, for education, for civil society, for media, et cetera, many, many things which were happening in the period you describe, as well as the period in the years following the coup, things that for safety and security reasons maybe weren't known so widely at this time outside of how that support was taking place. And so I'd be curious to get your thoughts as to the difference in those two contexts. What is being lost, obviously, from a Burmese context and from the support they're able to receive, but also from an American context, because these are networks that ultimately benefit the safety and security of America, whether it's promoting democratic countries away from the more authoritarian regimes and access to the world right now, whether it's health, whether it's security, whether it's terrorism, whether it's these scam centers that are building up. So if you could walk us through your knowledge of what was happening during the transition and after the coup, and then what you've been able to glean about the immediate impacts and your thoughts on the long-term impacts now that so much of that funding has been stopped.
Sure. I mean, this podcast is going to turn into a 3-hour audiobook, but I'm certainly happy to talk about that. And you're right. And I think it's very important to be clear. The U.S. government and USAID, who I work for, we are government agencies, and they're very clear and upfront that from the beginning, all of the assistance has a political objective to it. It might be a subtle one or a long-term objective of wanting to create a stable trading partner for American goods and products. It might be a safety and security aspect of wanting to ensure that there are not safe places for drug cartels or terrorist organizations to operate. But that doesn't mean that there can't also be a moral and ethical imperative for the work that the U.S. government and USAID does. Those two things can both exist. And I would say Myanmar is a classic place where both of those paradigms existed in many ways in harmony. In U.S. government policy, we wanted a stable and democratic Myanmar because Myanmar is incredibly geopolitically important. It sits between two of the world's superpowers in India and China. It is a resource-rich country, that goes from the Himalayan mountains all the way down, to the Gulf of Thailand and the Ottoman Sea. These are all things that would ultimately benefit the U.S. government to have good, strong, positive relationships with that government. And so that is a political dynamic that is absolutely at play. And I think, the historical interest in Myanmar has been a part of it. But I think there was also and remains a clear desire for the moral imperative, where we believe as a country deeply in the principles of democracy and a democratic and inclusive society. And the tragedy that was the military junta's destruction of that, democratic society was something that the U.S. government and those people in it, people like Mitch McConnell, had always wanted to be engaged on. They wanted to be involved in Myanmar because it was the right thing to do, because the people of Myanmar's will was very clear that they did not want the junta, but they wanted a democratic and inclusive society. And so the projects that we did were a part of both of those imperatives. And I've talked more specifically about my work in kind of the civil society space and building up their capacity and some of the humanitarian assistance that we've provided. Let's also be clear, there were health programs that were battling tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS that were incredibly effective. And Myanmar has a very high tuberculosis rate, particularly for Southeast Asia. And so that's a really important thing that they're doing. There were also economic projects. There was a project supporting coffee plantations, and we were actually able to get Myanmar organic fair trade coffee all the way to the US and on display shelves at Whole Foods. That certainly benefited the Myanmar farmers who were growing the coffee, as well as US business. Like, those two things can both exist. And those weren't projects I was running, but that others were in the kind of more traditional development sector. You know, when I was working there in my projects, we had a real focus on the communities that were the most impacted by conflict. And we're doing that because we know no country can fully reach its potential and its stability, and be a partner for the U.S. government if there are still active areas of conflict. And that type of support and engagement builds trust, and it builds relationships that can last through even the darkest times. And so there is an investment taking place there. And it was exciting to be a part of that. And I do feel in the early days, I think that partnership was mutual. I feel like Myanmar civil society really appreciated that they felt like the U.S. government was active and engaged in hearing what they needed and trying to honestly work with them to address those needs, not in a prescriptive manner that the U.S. government knows what's best for Myanmar, but really trying to understand what those challenges are and how to do those. But all of that takes resources. And it wasn't a small amount of resources that was going into Myanmar. But in a country the size of Myanmar, 56 million people, with the geographic distances that we're talking about, with the complex ethnic and religious dynamics, and a very resource scarce environment, it takes a lot to build back that society. But that investment was so much smaller than what's going to be needed now after the coup, and we've seen the destruction of the economy. And that's what people forget, is those initial smaller investments were really reaping benefits. And this coup has been such a slide back into the darkness and really just destroyed so many of those benefits that have been put in by the U.S. government over that period of time.
Right. So those are the benefits, the consequences, the potentials lost from the Myanmar side, which I think is probably the more obvious part of this question. To play devil's advocate of some of the criticisms that we're hearing is, well, okay, but it's time for America to take care of itself. America first, after all. It's let these other countries deal with what they need to do. We have problems here. We need to deal with our own problems. And so taking that kind of critique or devil's advocate argument, I think that in the short term, indeed, it probably will be pretty hard to find causal lines of consequence in terms of what this cutoff could lead in terms of impacting America, impacting the U.S. If you were theoretically to look at this, or perhaps even beyond theoretical, if there are things you've already thought or are already seen, looking at it from the United States point of view, what is the loss that perhaps they've already incurred, or what is the potential loss that they will incur beyond this, and the way that you might respond to that kind of critique that comes as a consequence of pulling out from Myanmar the way that it has?
Yeah, absolutely. And those critiques are fair. And I can understand from somebody who is sitting, thousands and thousands of miles away from Myanmar, doesn't understand the context there, but knows that maybe their school system is suffering and the kids don't have enough materials that they need in their own school system, or understands the limits of our healthcare system in the United States. Those are real challenges for real people. And I think it's understandable and reasonable for them to ask that question. Part of what people have to understand is that the amount of assistance that goes into a country like Myanmar, while the numbers may seem big to those of us who don't operate with millions of dollars, they are peanuts compared to what it is required to run U.S. healthcare systems, U.S. education systems. the amount of money that goes into saving lives in Myanmar is pennies on the dollar to what it would be required to get, better infrastructure and school systems in the United States. It wouldn't make a dent. If we take all of the money out of Myanmar and say, all right, well, we are going to put it into the US education system, that's buying desks for maybe one school system in one county, as opposed to actually providing life-saving assistance for those people in Myanmar. So there's definitely the value in what you get from that dollar is far greater in a place like Myanmar than it is in the United States. But even beyond that, even if you want to say, well, I don't care about the value of the dollar, I just think it should all stay in the United States because we have needs. There are really definitive issues going on in Myanmar that have a direct impact to the United States. One of the most obvious and most troubling is the drug trade. Myanmar is one of the world's largest producers of methamphetamines. They are one of the world's largest producers of opium. Both of those things end up in America and other countries throughout the world, and they are allowed to grow in scale there because the military junta uses them as a source of revenue to sustain an illegitimate government. That is an American interest. And those are American citizens who die from overdose to heroin and methamphetamines. We have a vested interest there. Another one that you've already alluded to are the scam centers that operate within Myanmar. These scam centers target individuals all over the world, stealing their identities, hacking into their bank accounts, annoying all of us with nonstop phone calls and emails. Those scam centers once again exist in Myanmar because a military junta uses them as a source of revenue to prop up an illegitimate government. And they do not want to shut them down. Those are things that have a direct billion-dollar impact on the global economy that we are negatively impacted from. Besides the fact that there are also just, quite frankly, large security questions taking place in a country that has rare earth metals. China continues to strike deals with armed groups and the military junta to get a hold of rare earth metals and other materials that put them in direct confrontation and competition with the United States. A friendly, democratic Myanmar ultimately benefits the United States in that geopolitical contest. And again, I'm not saying, and certainly from my point of view, I think there's an ethical and moral imperative for us to be there. But if you want to remove that ethical imperative from the equation and just look at security and economics, we benefit tremendously from the small amount of investment we put in through foreign assistance. We benefit tremendously economically and from a security perspective, not just in the long term, but in the immediate term, because these are immediate issues that we are faced with. I would also like to make an argument that there is an ethical imperative for us. We are a country built on values. Our Constitution, our Bill of Rights are things that form the backbone of American society. And for many people, are things that give them a sense of purpose, of pride, and of value. And it has long been our desire to share and protect those values and principles throughout the world because we deeply believe that a world based on the principles of democracy, of equality, of inclusion is a better world and one that we have a responsibility to work towards. Myanmar is a classic example. There are very few more clearly diametrically opposed opportunities in America, in the world, to be on the side of good versus the side of evil. The people of Myanmar have clearly spoken, both through the ballot, but also through their sacrifice and willingness to protest and lose their lives against this military junta, because they want a democratic and free and fair society. And we, as Americans, I believe, have a responsibility to protect and support that, because we say we say over and over again, those are our values and those are our priorities. And we have an opportunity, and I think a responsibility, to stand behind those in these moments.
That the part about the identity, that's interesting. It reminds me, I was in Stockholm recently and was speaking with a number of Swedes about the downturn in Swedish aid, and of course, then after those conversations, indeed, it was cut almost entirely from Myanmar, and they were in from a different standpoint. And I was also in Oslo and having similar conversations with Norwegians. They were coming with this identity argument, which I hadn't really considered before, which was really fascinating in this sense of, like, from their standpoints of, the way that Sweden and Norway engage similarly in similar ways, yet also very distinctly given their own countries and their place in the world. But there is this sense of pride that they could be a force for good, that they have a role to play and they could play that role. And so when we were looking at the downturn of aid from Sweden and Norway, respectively, a large part of the conversation was kind of almost like the psychological or philosophical reckoning of what it meant to be a country that or how it was to change the role of a country that they had a certain identity, and now that identity was being removed. Who are they? So I haven't heard that from the American standpoint, but it's kind of falling in line with that, and that's a very interesting argument and perspective to have, that there is this embedded part in the American identity of who we think we are and what we want to do in the world, and that aside from strategic aims and needs that are in other countries, and our own political vision, everything like that, at the heart of it, which is, again, until recently, been quite bipartisan. There has been a sense of how we see ourselves in the world, and this is impacting that fundamental question. Alongside that, another, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I'd like to get your thoughts on that. I'm looking at Myanmar's role in the world, and you have, in this conversation we've had to this point, you've outlined any number of extremely important and vital geopolitical, geostrategic roles that Myanmar plays. And so then I have to go to the question that I often go to with guests is, if this is all true, then why is it never being talked about? Why is it never rising to the, I mean, certainly not like Gaza or Ukraine, but not even a Syria or something. Why is both the scale of the conflict, the dramatic stakes, the good versus evil, dark versus light, that were the stark contrast that we're seeing, the incredible importance on so many levels that it's having, why is there such an extreme lack of political will, not just from countries, international organizations to engage, but even simple media to want to cover it to any amount of degree? I certainly have my own thoughts on that, and listeners over the years have offered theirs. But as someone who's been on the inside of this, I'd also be curious about your thinking as to why it has been so hard to put something so important and also so fascinating and so dynamic to get the attention that it obviously deserves.
Yeah, it's a good question, and sadly, you're going to hear the cynic in me come out. You just heard my defense for democratic values and our moral imperative is the U.S. Society. Now you'll hear my cynicism, and I think the reason that Myanmar is not a global phenomenon in the way that it deserves to be and does not receive the attention that it certainly deserves. There's a number of aspects, and I'll try to go through them one by one. One is that it is complex, and people don't like complexity. And I think for those of us who are obviously vested in Myanmar, there does seem like a very obvious good versus evil. You've got 90% of society that wants to live in a democracy and be free and have those freedoms ascribed to everybody, and then you have 10% of the society that is the military and supporting the military. And so it seems so obvious that there's a good versus evil there. But we also know that Myanmar is complex. The Rohingya genocide, certainly demonstrated the darker parts of many within Myanmar society. There are a number of armed groups, some of them fighting on the side of democracy, some of them not. But I think we know that all of those armed groups have at various times have had their hand in illicit industries. And so it makes for a muddy and more complex aspect. And I don't think people like complexity. But I think the primary reason that it doesn't hit the global stage is because it largely the problem remains within Myanmar. And I know we talked about already, the scam centers and the drug trade, and certainly those extend beyond the borders, but those are degrees of separation from impacting particularly Western society, as opposed to Israel, where one, you have large Jewish communities living within America and Europe who certainly have a strong voice within those countries, but also throughout the kind of the history of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, terrorist groups from different parts of the Israel-Palestinian conflict have attacked Western countries or had attacks on Jewish or Israeli citizens within Western countries. And so it's visible and present in Western societies in a way that Myanmar is not. And I think you can say the same thing for Syria, and you can certainly say the same thing for Ukraine, where those types of conflicts have spilled over in a way into Western society, either through terrorism or, in the case of Ukraine, through direct threat, in a way that Myanmar does not. And because, the military junta in Myanmar is not launching missiles into neighboring countries for the most part. There have been a few shells here and there in China and Thailand, but for the most part is not really impacting those neighboring countries. But also none of the armed actors in those conflicts in Myanmar are bringing terrorism into other countries, particularly other countries in the West. And so because there isn't this direct threat and clear, obvious connection between a terrible incident in Chicago or London or Paris and Myanmar, people are able to kind of dismiss it as over there, and it's not as important to us as it needs to be. And I think that's just the reality, is that people are able to kind of dismiss it in that way. And, I will say I am very, in some ways, thankful for that. I think a Myanmar that is expanding violence beyond its border is both bad for Myanmar as well as the rest of the world, but it does allow the rest of the world to kind of turn a blind eye. And I would finally just say, I think in general, the world is kind of overwhelmed right now with the number of complex environment and complex crises that are taking place, not just internationally, but often feeling like that's also a domestic concern. And that people's bandwidth to be able to focus on an issue and maintain their connection to it and their interest in it is just waning. And I think that really plays to Myanmar's disadvantage. And I think that's part of the underlying problem as well. So that's kind of the cynic in me. I do think we'll see a shift at some point. I think eventually just the geopolitical interest of Myanmar will come back into play because it's so important. But I don't know if it's going to have the public consciousness that it once did. I think that's probably going to be at the upper political levels and maybe not quite as the public support that Myanmar or Free Tibet, kind of those movements used to enjoy. I just don't know if we're going back to that type of atmosphere again.
Yeah, certainly. And I think another big role that played in there is the dynamic quality that Aung San Suu Kyi brought to everything. And then when her actions went against the image that many had built up of her, it just became too complicated, too frustrating to want to continue to engage and to look at it. And there hasn't been that dynamic figure or storyline that's been presented to be able to capture that attention. But I also agree with you that I think that it's a question of sooner or later. I mean, and this is what always happens with Myanmar, and there is going to be something is going to happen. There is going to be a brief window, positive or negative, where it's going to gather a lot of attention and people are going to try to do deep dives. And that's where I always laugh, because we're having this conversation now. I'd not be at all surprised if 3 to 5 years from now, it gets a spike in listens because some event happens that brings attention to suddenly everyone wanting to get background and understand these complexities that in these normal times, or not, they're certainly not normal times, but in these times where the political will and the attention is away, that focus isn't there. So that's what we find as well. With that, however, I want to move to the those really critical days after February 1st. We've built up a bit about U.S. Burmese relations, about your work and the U.S. government's work in Burma at that time. If you can then take us to the morning of February 1st and talk about how you learned of the coup, what your reaction was, and then immediately what you and the embassy, as far as you're able to tell, how you were able to then go and respond to it. And I think this is especially interesting and important because you talk about your role and your team's role as being involved with civil society actors. And of course, it's civil society actors that are the most targeted and the most active immediately in those days following the coup. Then the protests start days after that. And so, your ear are really on the tracks with this. Your fingers really on the pulse from those networks that are there. And I think, the fact that you have these networks is yet another kind of reminder of what U.S. funding is able to buy and able to access in terms of, the trust and the connection that's there at those times. But if you could take us then to that morning and the days and weeks that followed.
Sure, absolutely. So I will say I got back into the country a week before the coup. And if you'll recall, this is still during the height of COVID. So there were actually no flights in and out of Myanmar. You had to take a chartered flight. So it was quite difficult for me and my family actually to get back to Myanmar. And we were in quarantine in our house. And so but as things were moving towards February 1st, we were hearing the rumblings, obviously, that Min Aung Hlaing and Aung San Suu Kyi were struggling to come to an agreement of what power sharing was going to look like. And I won't get into the various rumors and speculation of what each side was offering, but it was very clear Min Aung Hlaing was concerned that his position was going to be diminished and that he might be even at threat. These were also with the ICC and ICJ indictments going on. And Aung San Suu Kyi clearly wanted to use her re-election to further exert her authority within the country, and they were not coming to agreement. And as you have said, I was well connected to a number of people within civil society, within the government, within parliament, and was having lots of phone calls with everyone trying to figure out hey, what's going to happen? I will fully admit that I did not believe there was going to be a coup. I knew things were tense. I felt pretty well connected with first or secondhand accounts of what was going on, but that ultimately there was going to be some type of agreement because the alternative was so grave, and that would have been such the analysis that I was providing, so people can note that this was the wrong analysis, was that largely the transition to democracy had worked out okay for the military. They still controlled a lot of the levers of power. They were still making money, and they were making more money because society was opening up and Western governments were coming in and putting more money and more investment. And so you had kind of this perfect kind of veneer of democracy while also still controlling a lot of the points of leverage. And I thought that benefited the military and those leaders pretty well, and that they wouldn't want that to be eroded. And I also thought that, Aung San Suu Kyi has been constantly making deals with shady people in order to maintain a position of power and to keep the party, the NLD, moving forward. And I kind of assumed that pragmatism would play out eventually as well. And so I really did not think that type of military coup was likely because it seemed like it was negative to both sides. So I go to bed that night, and at 4 a.m, I get a text from a civil society actor, a Rohingya civil society actor, who's also a good friend. And he's like, there was a coup, ASSK has been detained. And so that's how I found out. And immediately I get up and I start waking up everybody at the embassy to let them know what I've found out. And then very quickly, kind of the wheels of the U.S. government start turning, and we reach back out to Washington, and I'm calling more civil society partners and friends and Myanmar colleagues and friends, and kind of asking them what they've heard. And yeah, it's very quickly confirmed that yes, there has in fact been a coup, and that ASSK has been detained, and that other members of the parliament have been detained. I think very quickly we all saw that YouTube video of the young woman exercising as in Naypyidaw as the military vehicles zoom behind her to arrest more kind of politicians. And I was also watching that in real time, and we were all trying to figure out like what was this going to look like? What was the next step? And I've lived in a number of conflict areas and countries that have gone through coups before, so I was in that moment pretty adamant and confident that this was going to turn violent. It was only a matter of time, was my analysis at that point, and that was kind of my advice. I think you'll recall very quickly all communications went down, particularly in Yangon, but I think nationwide. But I can just speak for Yangon. Cell phone networks went down, internet went down. The U.S. Embassy has radios, and so we were able to communicate with each other via radio. The ambassador spoke to all American citizens under the U.S. Embassy, just kind of remind everybody to be calm, kind of here are the security postures, but, immediately then we were trying to think of like what to do. Now, the interesting part after the coup is not only did the communications go down, but all of the banks were closed. And it was very difficult for any of the traditional donors in the country to get access to money and to send money to civil society actors or any of their partners. Everything kind of got frozen. We were very lucky is that we had several civil society partners who actually had anticipated that this could go poorly and had actually withdrawn quite a bit of money and had cash in hand. And we were able to work with them very actively to basically sign contracts, and they would use cash in hand and we would repay cash at a later date in order to just kind of get the human rights and activist community kind of up and running and try to make sure that they had some forms of support to start their activities. Because again, we had been working with a lot of these groups beforehand. The US government, not just within my programs, but historically had been very involved in, again, democratic actors, human rights organizations, activists working on social campaigns around tolerance and diversity and freedom of speech. And so we had all of those partnerships, and many of them had active programs from the US government. They couldn't access their bank accounts either, but we did have some partners who could, or who already had cash. And so they were incredibly gracious. And this is just where the amazing part is not what the US government did. It's obviously what Myanmar civil society did. These organizations just banded together and, kind of with a promise from me that we'd pay them back, use their own money out of pocket to support everybody else in those early days and to make sure that systems were in place and that people could go protest and that people could get phone cards from Thailand to communicate to each other and, to really start the early parts of the CDM movement were all through these civil society organizations, doing so both at great risk, but also personal cost. And I was very lucky to be connected to many of them and get to see firsthand what they were doing, and in some small ways able to support that effort. But, the amazing part is what they were willing to do within days of this all happening. They were mobilized and acting.
That's really remarkable. It doesn't come as a surprise to me, given all the interviews we've done and my time in the country. But every time you hear it, you do have to just hold your head in awe for how dynamic, how courageous, how selfless so many of these are. And so I want to take just a moment before getting to what happens next to ask about these civil society actors, because I think there's this kind of misconception from outsiders from the West that nothing really happens in Burma, and then suddenly there's these big moments of 88 or 07 or 21 coup or whatever, and then boom, everything erupts, and then everything just kind of stems from that. And it's an incredibly ignorant and even delusional view that there's not this kind of groundwork that is happening in the hardest of conditions. And that's where I always refer to the works of like Elliot Prase Freeman or Delphine Schrank, who have written and researched so much about those networks at a time when it seems like nothing's going on, but really there's so much. And I'm sure that's also your work fits into that category in the transition period of just how dynamic and active it was during those years. And I think I often have these conversations with my American friends that are kind of bewildered what's going on in the US and what they can do about it. You know, Myanmar activists, they have been under such a life and death struggle of authoritarian stakes for so long that the levels of creativity and kind of brilliant innovation combined with, you know, just incredible personal sacrifice they've had to manage against these odds, it just shows through time and again. And so you know, I've spoken to people that from all kinds of fields who've referenced how far ahead some of these activists and civil society's actors are, how far ahead they are of anyone in the West, of the conditions they've had to operate in, and how they've been able to innovate, that they're doing things leaps and bounds ahead of what we can, you know, within those conditions. And so I just like to take a moment to have you give a bit of a more in-depth deep dive into, you know, what the manners that some of these activists, you know, after the coup, of course, but you know, it wasn't like they just suddenly after the coup were activated and knew exactly what to do and were able to make snap decisions that were really brilliant and worked. I mean, this was all the result of, you know, years, and not just years, but generations of having to learn how to navigate in these circumstances, so that when they were put in this situation, even though it might have been a new situation in terms of how things were actually happening at that time, it wasn't a new response. They had a lot to pull from. So if you could speak a bit about that background of civil society actors in Myanmar.
Yeah, absolutely. And you certainly articulated it very well. It's years and decades and generations of commitment and training and thought. And I think one of the things I always really try to emphasize, particularly to a Western audience, is the training aspect. Because I think sometimes there's this view that like civil society or movements are really just passionate people out on the street with flags. And that's part of it. But that takes a lot of thought and training to do that in a coordinated and effective manner that actually leads towards change. And there's a lot of other things going on behind the scenes that are probably more important than the number of people in the street, but you don't see unless you're a part of it. And so, you know, when we worked with civil society organizations, we did a number of different things. And part of what we would do is we would go into an area, maybe it's Rakhine, maybe it's Kachin, and we would meet with community leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, civil society organizations, and we'd get a map and a sense of like, hey, here's what everybody's doing in this community. And here are the things that when we kind of do an analysis of like where the priority areas are, where the challenges are, here are the groups that are doing work in that context. And then we sit and we talk with them like, what do you need? Like, what's most important to you? And really trying to have them identify what that needs are. And sometimes it's very basic. Sometimes they're like, you know what, we need a roof and we need better internet up here so we can do trainings and we can have access to information. Okay, that's very straightforward. Sometimes it's more complex. We used to do projects in the ethnic areas on fiscal federalism. Now that's a mouthful, but basically the idea of like decentralizing like the fiscal components of government, so it wasn't all centrally in Naypyidaw, but with the idea of eventually when democracy fully took hold and we had a fiscal or a federal nation that respected these ethnic areas, and how would the finances of the central government be adequately divided amongst these different groups so that all the communities were receiving financial assistance. That's a much more complicated ask. But they're thinking about that. And we're working with them on how to achieve those things and how to approach that issue on a granular level. And then there were groups doing hard, difficult work on reconciliation and dialogue between Rohingya and Rakhine communities. That's taking months and months of building up relationships with both communities and trying to help them see the other side's point of view and remove that dehumanization that so often clouds people's view in these tense moments. And so all of these groups were doing this type of work, and we were coming alongside and asking them what they needed, where the gaps were, and how we could possibly find the support to work with them. And I will say it was challenging from our point of view too, because there is an inclination, at least on, I think, a lot of Western sides, is like when we find an organization or an individual who's doing something good, we want to build them up. We want to turn them into what we're more familiar with, this like professionalized, quote unquote, nonprofit with, 100 people working for them and a great accounting system, and they can, get donor money. And a lot of these groups are like, no, we don't want that. We want to stay local. We want to be hands-on. I want to be training people in a remote village. I don't want to be sitting behind a computer writing donor reports. And so, and it took me a while to be like, yeah, you're right. How do we help facilitate that for you? How do we make sure that you can be on the ground doing the work and all of that admin that is needed? Because, right, we all want to make sure that the dollars and cents go where they're supposed to go, and that we can have some reports that show the impact that we're having with our money. All of that exists, and we need that and want that, but we don't want that to come at the expense of doing the actual work. And so that was kind of my job. How do we figure out how to let them do the actual work while making sure we have all of that other stuff that we need to run good projects? And it was so fun to work with these different groups and try to meet them at different levels. And sometimes I would be working with one individual with a good idea. And sometimes I'd be working with really professionalized, nonprofit CSOs who had 100 staff and did all sorts of different things. But they were on the ground every day, working with the community, thinking strategically about how to address the complex challenges in Myanmar, so that when the coup hit, many of them already had the network in place to, for one, just communicate with their communities, because everyone was cut off by cell phones and internet. So how do you make sure information is traveling efficiently? And how do you make sure that people believe the information they're getting? Well, these networks had that in place. They knew how to communicate to their communities. How do you organize people for a collective action? Well, again, they are used to bringing people together, training them on a set of principles or ideas or concepts, and then moving them towards action. So all of these things were in place prior to the coup. It was simply a matter of either activating those networks or kind of redirecting what the focus was. Maybe the focus shifted from, there were groups that were fighting environmental pollution on some of the rivers in Shan and Kachin State. Well, now the focus is going to shift from that specific issue to government and democracy more generally. But they were ready for it. They knew how to do it. They just needed the resources. And ultimately, it was a lot of connecting them with more and more groups to make what used to be a regional movement into a national movement. And that was what happened very quickly over the weeks after the coup on February 1st.
And so then shifting the focus from looking at the civil society to looking at the embassy, in a situation like this, how does a diplomatic mission decide what it's allowed to do? There is an event, a social political event occurring in another country, and as a diplomatic mission that's there, I understand. I would imagine there's certain international protocols or expectations that are in place. Of course, there's a lot of things that happen outside those lines, and then, of course, the whole legality of what the military is doing is another question altogether. This is a complex mix. So, how are those discussions involved? I think first, if you could just give a general sense of international protocols, and then because as you mentioned, you've been in other conflict situations, and so just as you knew that the coup would turn violent, I suppose you also started to think through, what is the role I want us to be playing, and what is the role that we're able to go and play, and the decisions that we're able to make. So talk through that kind of protocol and mission.
Yeah, it's not going to come as a surprise. Government institutions move slowly and more slowly than you would want, and so that's hard. That's frustrating. I will say the one advantage we had as an embassy is one, actually everybody in the embassy. Maybe I think it was a kind of a legacy of historically the Myanmar mission was very small. The Myanmar embassy was very small. And so all of the people who worked at it, whether you were USAID or State Department or a military attaché or just somebody from the DEA, you all worked together. You knew each other and you actually did collaborate. In big embassies globally, that's often not the case. You can be very siloed, and I don't think that's surprising to anybody. But the Myanmar mission worked well together, and so we had that as an advantage. And then also, it hadn't been that long since, well, the Rohingya genocide for one, but in even 2012 wasn't that long ago of living under a junta, and so there was a memory and kind of a historic muscle memory to like how we acted in those moments. And that helped us move a bit faster than maybe we traditionally would have in a place that like maybe had no context, for this type of event. So that certainly took place too. And yeah, it was hard. You're right. There are lots of rules and regulations on what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And there's a lot of like, well, do we need to check that with Washington? But Washington's 12 hours behind us. How long do we want to wait before somebody can make that decision? The ambassador, Tom Bido, was new. It was a new ambassador and had come in during COVID. And, so he had been in Burma before, or in Myanmar before, but it was a new post for him as an ambassador. So all of those things were challenging. I will say the U.S. and U.S. embassies, as opposed to other countries, blessing and a curse, they tend to be bigger and have more resources. And so I think some of our counterparts and some of like the European missions were surprised at how quickly we started doing a bunch of different things, whether that was writing reports or trying to get money out the door or communicating to headquarters and getting messaging out, because we just had more people who could do those things. But I will say I was very lucky that the projects I was running were designed to be fast, flexible, and responsive. And so we had already designed in a level of autonomy and flexibility that those early moments really allowed us to engage civil society and create systems and networks and support to help them in their struggle for democracy. And ultimately, then we can get into this a little bit later, helping them keep them safe and secure. Besides the fact that I've probably forgotten, the exact moments of when things were approved and when which ambassador or which, person in the National Security Council said what, I don't want to get too into the internal dynamics of U.S. government decision-making, other than to say, like, it was very clear which side of the equation we were on pretty much immediately. Like, we were supporting the elected government and the people's voice. But what that meant and how far the U.S. government was willing to push that was hard for them to understand, because, and I know, looking in hindsight, being 2020, it's obvious that, they should have taken a hard public stance immediately. And of course they did. They made statements, about the election. Could they have been more forward-leaning? Could we have been more forward-leaning? Yeah, probably. But there was also a desire to maybe we can play a role to back this up. Like, if we don't burn all our bridges with men online in the military, can we engage in a way that might help them change their mind? Could we play that role? Like, that was still a consideration. And then also, certainly from the part of leadership at the embassy, a consideration of safety and security for the people under their authority. If they say something too extreme or do something too extreme towards the military, does it put U.S. citizens at risk? And that was also a legitimate concern. We can debate endlessly, every decision, and there were good ones and there were bad ones. I will say what was impressive about the U.S. Embassy in this stance, they were willing to push the envelope. They were willing to try to let those who had fast and flexible mechanisms use it. And a number of occasions, and I just mean this very sincerely, of people just doing the right thing, even when it might not have been what was allowed or what was the easiest thing, but just making decisions that are like, no, this is the right decision. like, we're going to do that. And again, not perfect. I don't want to pretend the U.S. government, trust me, I was a thorn in the flesh of many people within the U.S. government during this time about what I wanted to do and what I thought was best, and being frustrated when things didn't happen. So I don't want to pretend we were perfect at all. But it was very inspiring to see people make the right choice more often than make the wrong choice.
Yeah, certainly. And, the U.S. mission definitely has that history in '88 and the democracy movement. Then there was, we've done interviews with individuals who were around way back then and talked about the role that the U.S. Embassy played in being able to support the media coverage and the few images that were available then, and being able to get them out, and pre-internet age when things were really closed off. And then I personally arrived in Myanmar during Saffron. That was my first welcome, and then Nargis was my second. That was when I arrived. I was working for the American Center, so I was connected to in some way to the embassy then. And arriving after Saffron, or arriving as Saffron being my welcome as I arrived, I didn't have the context. I wasn't settled, but I being around the conversations that were happening, and then later the reporting that has since been done, I think both the what's out there in the public space, the role that the U.S. Embassy played again in being able to get media and make sure that media and images were getting out there. And then, just on a personal level, to echo what you said, the number of people that were engaged in trying to do the right thing as they saw it in those really tense times, and often putting themselves in just immense risk in doing so, was just astounding. So there's a bit of that institutional history that's there from those previous crises. And then as we look at post 21, the responses that are happening, I think and the one I want to ask you about as we get more into this, I think the thing that really struck me when it happened, it really kind of surprised me, and I think there was pushback to this, if I remember, it was when the ambassador, and I should mention that when I was at the American Center, that was when Tom, the later ambassador, that was when he had arrived in Burma. He was, I think he was the DCM at the time, and yes. And he and his wife are incredibly supportive of Burmese and of the democracy movement, and are deeply personally invested in that. Certainly I can say that from my time at the American Center and how I knew them then. And so building that up, when Tom, as ambassador, with his wife Amy, went to visit the site, I think it was a school where some youths had been gunned down, and there was like a makeshift memorial for them, and I think they officially went and placed flowers. To me, that was an extraordinary act, and I think it did receive pushback. I'm not sure if you remember the incident I'm talking about, but if I'm wondering what your thoughts were on that decision, and then the circumstances surrounding it, and then based on the reaction, if there were changes in kind of the official response that happened in the days and weeks.
Yeah, I certainly remember that event, and there was absolutely pushback, both by the military junta, and I think, and I'm speculating a little bit, but I don't know that Washington loved that just because of the risk that they felt that it put him in and American citizens. But with that said, that was the right thing to do, and. These are these complex things. And I was definitely probably on the side of we need to do more of that and be more out in public. And my reasoning for that was this, and it's actually before that event. There was, roughly 10 days, I can't remember, maybe even 2 weeks. I can tell you exactly when the first shots were fired because it was when the first flight evacuating U.S. citizens was. But I'd have to look it up. But there was a very amazing peaceful period of the protests were peaceful. And while the military was out in force and maybe pushing people around and using, some physical tactics, there were no gunshots. The violence was relatively limited at that time. And I really felt like we needed to be engaged as much as possible during this time of peaceful protests because there was no political gray area. The protests were peaceful. Like it's their right to protest what has happened, and they're doing so peacefully, and we just needed to be on that side. As soon as the violence started, and we know who perpetrated the majority of the violence, we know who started the violence for sure, was the junta. But once the violence started, there can be a narrative of, kind of both isms. Well, they're both carrying out acts of violence. Well, they're both doing these things, and I didn't want us to have to be in that space. And I think part of what was difficult in that moment when Tom and his wife went and laid the flowers to mark the spot of the shooting of the student is that narrative had started, of like, oh, well, you're intervening in a domestic internal affair, and you're intervening on the side of these violent protests, which of course we know wasn't true, but it just complicates the waters. And these are the hard decisions that like the ambassador has to make. Like he's in a lose-lose situation in these moments. Let's just be clear. And he's trying his best to both follow his own individual moral compass, and then he is taking direction from Washington and also trying to think of what is best for all of the Americans under his authority and responsibility. And those are hard, difficult choices to make. I am certain that if you interviewed him on this podcast, he could probably say 5 things early in those days he wished he would have done differently, like all of us can. But he was doing his best and certainly empowered those that were working at the embassy and with USAID to try to make a significant difference during those moments, and really gave us, I would say, quite a bit of latitude to do that in ways that were not normal government functions. So I really have to commend that aspect of what we did, even if I think we would all say we wish we did more.
Certainly, and I think that kind of dynamic risk-taking action, I think just anecdotally speaking, as well as what's on record, I think that that the American mission has done that over the years, and certainly, I think that it's so important to flesh out this context in terms of so easy to look back now in safety at how things turned out and to be able to say what should have happened this way or that way. But, in real times, things are confusing. And, there were shots fired at the New American Center. And I don't think that's ever really been determined who fired them and what that purpose was and if it really was a threat. And going back to 2007 with Saffron, I'm also as you're setting this context, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with, I think it was, I don't know the exact title. He was like the chief security officer of the the U.S. mission at the time, and I remember speaking to him informally after Saffron, and he was talking about how he had a meeting at that time with his counterparts in the Burmese military, and he was in the meeting. He was just kind of on their case about how violent they were being with cracking heads during Saffron, and just kind of chiding them and saying, you don't need to be doing that. It's this is out of line. Like, I understand you're trying to affect security, but this is a bit too far. And I remarked how, and he went on to share some other things as well, other parts of that conversation. And I remarked how amazed I was that he was just able to sit down and have a conversation of that nature informally off the record with someone in that position. And he remarked, it's so important that we're always talking, whatever it is that's actually happening, however much we disagree, vehemently against what is actually taking place. It's so important that we have a phone that we're able to pick up and have a conversation with someone on the other line and just be able to talk. And that never breaks down, regardless of how extreme the situations on the ground are becoming. So when you mentioned that context and hoping that at that time that there was a hope that Lung could be walked back, I think that and many guests on this podcast, both journalists and diplomats, have spoken before about how this iteration of the military is so beyond reach, that and that really is a difference. That however bad, however terrible things have been in the recent past, there's always been someone to pick up the other line, to whether as a journalist to hear their side of the story, or whether as a diplomat to be able to simply to have a conversation. And that these days that has become exceedingly difficult. And so when we're going back and setting that context, as well as then what comes next, what are your thoughts on the difficulty of being able to have that kind of engagement as has been seen in the recent past?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's why you have diplomatic missions and these roles in government, and it's why within society there are different roles for people to play. Like, part of the government's role in these diplomatic missions is to keep that line open, and it's to talk to bad people. Like, that's the reality. You're going to talk to some really awful human beings doing some really awful things, but your conversations might enable you to influence them in some positive ways. And it's really important to keep those lines open, or at the very least, to know what you're sacrificing when those lines close. And I think sometimes people can get a little moralistic. It's like, oh, I can't believe they're talking to so-and-so. Well, I don't want the US government to be a human rights advocate. Like, that's human rights organizations' job, because the US government, and we work with human rights people and we have our own human rights mechanisms, but that is not the US government's primary role. Like, we are an interlocutor with other governments. That's our primary role. And it's important to keep that, or if we give that up, to do so for a very specific reason that we've thought through, not just because of happenstance. And I think that's what Washington and the ambassador and many others, certainly in those early stages, and I would say even within the first like 3 to 6 months, we're trying to figure out, like, what's the value of keeping this line open? What influence does it have? What do we get out of it? Knowing that it is ethically questionable to talk to these guys, but is still valuable. And I think the more interesting argument is, is there a point now where that line of communication actually isn't valuable because you don't get anything from it, and it actually does more harm than good because it gives legitimacy to the junta, but you never get anything from it. And that's kind of where I think we are now, in an interesting question. And I'm no longer with the US government, so I can speak freely. Like, I think we crossed that line where we don't actually get anything from the relationship. It largely is detrimental to us and to the democratic movement, and it only really kind of benefits the junta. Now, I haven't been in Myanmar for 4 years, so I'm not going to pretend that I am nearly as informed as I used to be, even though I still certainly work on things there and have colleagues there. But because, to your point, like, they either don't respond, you can't engage them, you can't get a hold of whom you need to get a hold with, and when you do, the ability to have any conversation of substance is almost zero at this point. And that does feel different than it used to in the past. Although I will say, Myanmar was always difficult on that regard. Like, it's definitely been one of the harder places to have those consistent conversations with some of those figures. And I think because of the isolation that they've operated in for so long, especially the senior people at those levels, you are dealing with a mindset and a worldview that is often beyond your comprehension. And so it can be really hard to have those conversations. I think there is a reasonable conversation to have of, like, what does not just the US, but many countries, like, what are they getting out of their diplomatic missions in those countries, or in that country? Could they do more if it changed? And I would only advocate doing that if they really had a plan for if they were going to change their diplomatic status in a significant way. What does that look like? It can't just be like, we're done, we're out. What are you doing with that message, with that movement? And I think with the upcoming possible elections, quote unquote, taking place, I think there's some real opportunity to show some moral backbone and even shift those diplomatic relations other directions that could have an impact. And I would love a more thoughtful conversation in the international community about that. But that's another podcast.
Certainly, and those are podcasts that we're working on. That's another yet another urgent priority in this poly crisis that's taking over Myanmar as the run up to the elections. But I want to get back to those early days again because you mentioned how the speed with which that the U.S. mission was able to operate even took some of the Europeans and other Western countries by surprise, and indeed in recent podcast conversation we had with Paul Greening, he went out of his way to mention that the U.S. embassy was doing things that the British and the others were not capable or were not willing or did not have the ability of, or et cetera, et cetera. And two of those features that I know that the U.S. Embassy was engaged with that we'll talk about in just a moment are the ability to set up safe houses and the ability to provide escape routes. These are really hairy things. I mean, these are the subjects of adventure movies, suspense films, and the like. This is all happening more or less on the fly, going from, again, for those that don't have context, this is going from I guess we could say a poorly functioning democracy, but a more a society where things are working to some degree. And the especially in the urban areas, especially among the Bamar, there's not overt repression and oppression and authoritarianism taking place in those contexts. Of course, an ethnic area is a completely different story. And so this really is going from day to night. It's reverting back to night. This is an experience that unfortunately has existed in Myanmar before. But that being said, it's a dramatic change, and it's a dramatic change for a lot of young people who don't remember what those battle days were like. And so moving to that ability to be able to set up safe houses, to be able to make escape routes and everything else that was being done, as far as is safe to tell, and of course without giving away particular details that would put those at risk, what can you tell us about those activities?
Sure. So I would two quick things to emphasize. So the U.S. government has engaged in protecting human rights advocates, civil society activists in closed countries for decades. So it is not unknown for the U.S. government to support these activities. And I will say usually supporting an organization who supports these activities is usually how it works. And they also have mechanisms within their immigration system to do these things. And unfortunately, those mechanisms have come under political turmoil right now. When you talk about things like the humanitarian parole visa, which has long been a tool, a rarely used and very misunderstood tool of the U.S. government to support political or human rights activists who's under direct threat, and to support them to get them somewhere safe. And man, that is the best part of America. The fact that we've thought through and we're like, yeah, we need a way to help keep these people safe. And we're even going to think down to the level of their immigration status. And we're going to have a system in place to help these people. And man, the number of people that used to get that visa, I mean, it was so small, you're talking maybe 10 a year historically. Now, there's been some changes, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Venezuela. There's been some things that have happened that have upended that a little bit. But that is amazing. And that's one of those things that other countries didn't have. They're like, we don't know how to do this. We're like, we do. We know how to do this. It took a while because 99.9% of the U.S. government doesn't know how to do that, but 1% of it does. And once you get those people and you figure it out, man, you can use it effectively. And it's awesome. So that was one of the things that gave us a real advantage. The other thing, and I'm just going to go back to giving credit to Myanmar civil society, we had partners that had money and had access to money when no one else did, including the embassies. And they were willing to use it. And luckily, myself, I had a good relationship. We had a very strong level of trust between myself and some of these partners. And they were willing to, at great risk, both financially, but also physically, help establish these safe houses and these routes to get people out of the country. And, to the level of scouting out locations and figuring out what made the most sense and how, when someone's in a safe house, how do they get food? Who brings it to them? How do they communicate their needs? All of these details that go into these things. You have to do it discreetly. You have to change phones. You have to change SIM cards. Really thinking through. And they did all of this on the fly, having never done it before, sitting down and going through together. Okay, here are the rules for safe houses. Here's how we operate them. Here's how we maintain them. Here's what they need to look like. Here's how often you can visit them. Here's, how many people per each one. Here are the types of people that should go in each one, because not everybody always gets along with everybody else. We also had protection concerns. Got to make sure that men and women aren't mixed unless they're direct family members. Like all of these concerns, while people were literally running from their lives. Or for their lives, sorry, not from their lives, but also, I guess, running from their former life in many ways. And so, again, I was saying, to the U.S. government's credit, we had some pretty fast and flexible mechanisms already in place, and given the green light to use those mechanisms creatively to help these organizations set these routes up. It was really impressive. It's some of the more meaningful work and more exhausting work I've ever done. Because the other thing that you have to have when you're doing these things is somebody needs to be available 24 hours a day to respond to people in crisis and at risk, and to take their phone call or take their text message, respond to them, pick them up, move them to a safe location, ensure that they're there for an appropriate amount of time, and if appropriate, move them out, help them move out of the country so that they can be safe and outside the reach of the military junta. And that's exhausting work, because it never stops. And you often in your job, you're like, well, this isn't life or death if I don't answer this email or if I don't answer this phone call. And that was definitely one of the few experiences in my life where I'm like, oh no, this is a life or death. I need to answer this phone call, or I need to answer this text message. And in the early days, I was managing the bulk of that. And then his partners kind of stood up, and they were able to get people trained and, talk through the real risk that was being taken, and responsibly kind of bring other people into the system. Because again, it was very difficult. You didn't want to bring anybody in who, didn't want anybody working on these things who didn't understand the risk. But it was hard to explain to them what we were doing without telling them everything, and therefore they're already at risk. And so that was very difficult. Again, it took a lot of trust between, myself, the partners, individuals working within those organizations to really establish this. And the organizations, the work that they did, the risk that these people took was just outstanding. And they're still doing it. And many of them are doing it they're doing it without any support from the U.S. government, but they are still doing it. They're still maintaining these systems because they know it's the right thing to do, and they're invested in the safety. And, to your point of what happens when the U.S. government pulls out of their funding modalities, people die. And I think you probably know as well as I do, Jimmy, one of the leaders of the 88 generation movement, who was executed several years ago. Literally weeks before he was detained, we were discussing whether or not he wanted to go into one of these safe houses. And he deferred. He's like, no, I'm doing things. Like, he made a decision. And not to say that if he would have made a different decision, the outcome would have been different. Who knows? But, when these systems aren't available, like, the risk is people dying. And that's what's so tragic about the U.S. government pulling this type of foreign aid and this assistance, is that the consequences are very real and very tangible to those on the ground, especially in light of like how positive of an impact they had in the early days. It's very sad to think that we would not be in a position. And I think the earthquake in Myanmar is an example of not being in the position to do that now.
Right. That's really harrowing stuff. And, you describe setting up these safe houses. and the protocols that have to go through that. I mean, that's incredible stuff. I know the other work that was being done was providing escape routes. No easy thing when border crossings are immensely difficult to manage, and you can't go through official channels. So again, as far as is safe to share without putting anyone or any network at risk, what can you tell us about the nature of the escape routes that were able to be provided?
Yeah, so I just need to emphasize here on those escape routes, like we were dependent on working with like members of the ethnic armed organizations, and coordinating with them because it almost always went through their territory, and working with a number of organizations that may or may not have always been Myanmar based organizations, to help facilitate those things. And so it talk about a community effort, I guess is the way I would want to describe it, from maybe an individual like me getting the initial like intake form, to the partner managing a safe house and bringing people meals, to the driver who would often drive them through various checkpoints at great risk to themselves, usually helping establish like fake IDs for individuals to get through those checkpoints, getting into areas that weren't controlled by the junta, and then using jungle footpaths to move people to safe areas, in great coordination with many in the opposition movements and ethnically controlled areas. And then organizations that were in Thailand and other countries, taking responsibility for them once they crossed and to help get them food and medical supplies. And so the community of practice that allowed for these things was really intense, but impressive. And I still can't believe that it didn't go worse. Like the number of different times where if one person dropped the ball, if one person did the wrong thing or forgot something or communicated in an inappropriate way or wasn't using safety and security protocols, like the worst possible scenarios could have played out. And we were just very lucky, and I think also very skilled, the people who were working on it, and very thoughtful that those things didn't happen. And again, some of the, quote unquote escape routes were, honestly, just somebody sitting in a car and having a really good fake ID and able to get to a town where there wasn't junta control and heading off on their own, to either EAO controlled areas or crossing a border. But others, were deep jungle treks and walking for long periods of time and staying in EAO encampments, because it kind of depended on the individual and the routes that were being taken and the timing. How early on during the crisis did they leave? It all changed, week to week. We'd have to do new assessments on what the safe ways and safe directions were. But it was, a huge group effort. And I don't want to undersell just how difficult it was for all the people who had to go through this, not just the leaving their lives behind and making this tremendously difficult decision to flee their home and their families and knowing they're at risk, but just like the isolation of being stuck in a safe house for long periods of time, of not being told when or where exactly you were being moved, because we might not have had that information yet. Being woken up and told, okay, we're going to move, we're going to go this way and we're going to do this, and really being at the control of so many other people. And that is incredibly emotionally and physically taxing on all of these people who had to go through it. And so, the toll for many people who were able to leave while they were physically safe, it is still quite the burden that they carry, besides the fact of just wrestling with leaving. And I know so many people who left, they did so because they had to and were at great risk, but it comes at a huge emotional cost of knowing that like other people are still in country, putting themselves at risk. Fighting against the junta in country is very difficult for many who have left. And I do want to acknowledge that, because I know it's a burden that many of them carry, and will probably carry for a long time, but they did the best they could at the moment that they had to make those choices.
These are the way you're describing the situation. I mean, the stakes are so high. There's so much tension in the air. There's the difference between, you know, doing this or doing that could cost a life. And then the stress that you're under in terms of the life or death stakes of, you know, simple phone calls or texts. To illustrate all of this, I wonder if I can prompt you to give us one anecdote, obviously leaving out identifying details that would put anyone at risk, or if at this point there are some identifying details that are safe to share, I leave that to you. But I wonder if, just to give us a real sense of the urgency and the stakes and the danger of these processes of escape routes and safe houses, I wonder if you can recall some anecdote and walk us through some real situation that happened in trying to get someone to safety.
Sure. Yeah, I can add, so early in the very early stages of the coup, um, an individual, and I'll keep names out of it, but an individual that was pretty senior in the NLD government reached out to me and was obviously on the run because they were detaining all members of the NLD government. He was one of the few that had not been detained in the immediate kind of 48 hours after ASSK was detained. And we really didn't have much established. And so one of my partners who I worked with took it upon themselves to find kind of lodging for them and actually stayed with them. And I emphasize this because the individual who did it was a Rohingya colleague. And the NLD, the person in the NLD government had made numerous, quite frankly, cruel and unsubstantiated claims against the Rohingya during the genocide in 2017. And yet, despite this obvious grievance that they could have, still took it upon themselves to personally establish their safety for multiple days and stay with them and sit with them and talk through their risk and concerns. And then to get the individual out of the country, had to forge multiple IDs and disguises, put them in a vehicle with other individuals who were not at risk but needed to travel, so that it looked like they were traveling as a family group, because the person was on the list of targeted individuals by the junta. It was very clear that the junta was looking for the individual. And so they wanted them to travel as like a family unit. And so again, these individuals putting themselves at risk, who are not at risk of detention, but willing to travel with a senior NLD government official to get them out of the country. And I still remember them talking about going through these checkpoints, and the other quote unquote family members who again, would not be at risk traveling on their own, but now that they're traveling with this person are at risk. Just the steely determination. They were just saying how those people never blinked an eye. They were perfectly calm throughout the entire process. Now the NLD politician was quite nervous throughout the whole thing, and they kept having to kind of calm him down throughout the process. And they had to go through that. I think they went through 3 or 4 checkpoints. Again, using the fake IDs, very slight disguises, traveling as a family group to get through the checkpoints, so that they could eventually reach KNU territory and the person was able to leave the country. And so I just emphasize this anecdote because it really, to me, exemplifies the beauty of this crisis, that these people that historically would be aggrieved towards each other and antagonistic towards each other were willing to do so much to save each other in this crisis moment, because they knew they were both fighting for something greater, fighting for their nation, their sense of democracy and freedom, and were willing to sacrifice themselves, but also work with people who had historically, I don't want to say necessarily enemies, but certainly on other sides of the spectrum, and to take that risk on their behalf is quite telling. And those are the relationships that give me hope for Myanmar in the future, even though we're in a dark state right now. I think there have been so many relationships built through this crisis where people are able to see the other side and to understand what they went through. And you hear these narratives quite a bit where, people now have a much greater understanding of just how brutal and terrible the junta is. And this was one of the earliest moments of awakening that I saw during this crisis. And so I definitely would like to emphasize that. On a slightly funnier anecdote, I do remember there was a group of youth activists who were quite young and were not in the activist community, but got very involved in the CDM movement and were involved in protests that turned violent. The military attacked, but they were being looked for because they were very prominent musicians and actors and actresses. And so they had to flee, and they went through KNU territory. We organized routes for them through that way because they were quite well known. And they had to stay in jungle camps for a very long period of time until they could actually move them, because it wasn't safe to move them from one camp to another because the military was bombing, different KNU locations. And so they had to keep them safe. And so they really had to remain in these jungle camps for a long period of time. And the number of text messages I would get, both from them, but also from members of the KNU and others who were like, this group is struggling in the jungle. They were not prepared for this. They brought a guitar. We told them they had to leave their dog behind. These kind of stories add a little bit of levity to it. They all made it through safely, and I think it's probably a funny story that they tell now, at least that moment in the camps. But it was definitely like, oh, we need to be more clear with everybody what they're getting into when they're leaving. Because I think there were some misconceptions early on how easy or rough the process of fleeing through these escape routes might have been.
Wow, that's incredible. And the story about the senior NLD politician who had his own Rohingya bias and then was rescued by Rohingya. I've told this story before. I think it's worth sharing this anecdote here because there's some similarities as different as this is. I went to a small liberal arts college, and there was a student who was an Orthodox Jew, and one evening or rather one morning, he woke up and found that during the evening, some people had carved Nazi swastikas and other demeaning words into his door. He was obviously, extremely upset and shocked, as anyone would be, by that kind of hateful language. As it so happened, this student before this incident, was virulently homophobic and just had a deep hatred, you could really say, of the gay community. And after this incident happened, who would come to his defense more than any other on campus but the LGBT club? They were the ones that had his back, that spoke in terms of solidarity, that spoke in terms of an attack against one is an attack against all. And at a time, and mobilized an entire campus-wide rally against hate speech, and saying that this will simply not be tolerated. We are your allies. We have your back. We're here for you. As you can imagine, this experience for this Jewish student was life-changing, and he had to reflect on this anger or this hatred and dislike that he had of a community, which then was the only community that really stood up with him and for him in a way that no one else did on campus. And so he had to go through his own internal process, which he went through, of letting this go and realizing that this was no longer something that he could hold within him. And he had to look at his own biases that were pushing this discrimination was no different than the discrimination that was pushed on him in the form of Nazi swastikas carved on his door. And, to his credit, went through a transformation and was able to get over that kind of life. He came from a very conservative part of the country, and was able to get over that conditioning, through this response. And so with that anecdote in mind, I'm thinking about this senior NLD politician who has held these, not just held, but promoted, which is even worse, because you're not just a product of conditioning, but then you're adding on to the conditioning of others, these anti-Rohingya views. And then in a very similar situation, who is there to save him in his time of greatest need but a Rohingya? And so what was, as far as you know, what was the process that he went through after? Was he able to look within, as this Jewish student did, and be able to examine these biases, examine the solidarity, and to and to become a kind of symbol of being able to take that as a learning moment and to show a better future and to show a better way? Or what was that internal process as far as you were able to know after the fact, after he was safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, I think one, it was a real reflection of how much the Rohingya were part of the Myanmar community, and like that realization of like, these aren't, because I think he, part of it, he ascribed to that narrative that like, no, these are really people from Bangladesh, and like, the UN brought him in here in the 70s, and kind of those narratives that like there was some logical explanation to this division, and they could explain it away through drawing a line on a map at a certain time. And so part of it was just this realization of like, no, this person loves this country and treats it like their home in the same way I do, and just exposure to somebody like that. But I think also just a realization of the position he was put in as a politician, and that it wasn't worth it, what he was being asked to do in those moments, where he disparaged the Rohingya and questioned the narrative of what had happened to them, how much of that was about politics and not his own personal experience or personal journey. And then all of a sudden he had this very direct personal experience and personal relationship that just would not allow that false narrative or that convenient narrative to be true anymore. And then again, I just emphasize, like, I feel like for him, a real sense of unity, of like a unity of cause, that they were all in it together now. And that felt very transformational to him and allowed him to be an advocate for the Rohingya and other ethnic groups, because now there was a sense of belonging and unity amongst those groups that he understood in a new and more meaningful way.
Right, that's quite powerful. And I want to follow up with this anecdote and these series of anecdotes you're saying, the position that you found yourself in, where again, going back to this comment you made that this was a case where literally a phone call or a text was a matter of life and death. And even though you weren't in direct harm's way, you were speaking to and coordinating and literally saving lives of those who very much were. And so this, there's a lot of trauma in this. There's a lot of there's a lot of heightened emotions that are happening at this time. And so when you look back at that period, how were you able to maintain your mental balance? How were you able to manage the extreme emotions that were coming up of people that you really cared about, that you knew for a long time, that were in harm's way, as well as others that you maybe only met a few moments ago, that a trusted contact was telling you needed to, and knowing that your decisions met the difference in some cases of what degree of safety they would have. So that's a lot to hold. And I'm sure there's within all of that as well, you're also hearing about those unfortunate cases that where one is too late, or the connections aren't made, or things turn out badly, which is a whole other thing to have to hold. So how are you able to manage that yourself, personally speaking?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly appreciate that question. And, it was very challenging. It was an incredibly difficult time, certainly for me personally, for my family, for friends, while acknowledging I came from and existed in that moment in a serious position of privilege. Obviously as a foreigner, but then also a foreigner connected to the U.S. Embassy, my risk level was insignificant compared to most of the other people, taking action. And so that gave me a level of comfort and confidence that no one else that I was working with would have been afforded. And I was, I think, well aware of that. I'm also very lucky that I was going into that situation, one, having been in crises before. So I was attuned to how my body reacted, how my mental state reacted, what I was good at and what I wasn't good at, and how to kind of engage with a crisis moment in a way that I think most people probably have not experienced on a consistent basis. And so was able to take those steps in terms of just how to kind of control that space. And so even though I was working, gosh, sometimes it felt like 24 hours a day, but I would say consistently working 18, 20-hour days, I always took time to work out. I always took 30 minutes. I remember there was a company in Myanmar, and I'm blanking on the name right now, but they made really good yogurt. They had a ginger yogurt that I really liked.
Annie's yogurt.
Yes, Annie's yogurt. Yes, there we are. And I would take 25 to 30 minutes. I'd put a timer on, and I would sit outside of my house, and I would eat yogurt and granola, and I'd drink a cup of coffee, and I wouldn't check my phone, and I just gave myself that time. I just needed 30 minutes of headspace to not feel like I had to be on. And then I'm very lucky. I have an amazing family, a great wife, awesome kids. Of course, they evacuated. We knew that immediately, and it always feels weird when other people are at risk and you get to send your family away so easily. But I also had comfort that any of my Myanmar colleagues would have absolutely done the same thing too if it was afforded to them. It was very hard. We lived apart for a long time. But I had a network, a support system that loved and cared for me. And so that allowed me to remain grounded during these times of crisis. Now, I will also fully admit, I didn't always handle stress great. Probably yelled at people more than I should have. Not people we were like trying to help, but like my colleagues, people in Washington, D.C. I was probably, more animated than was always effective. And when I finally did leave Myanmar and went back and visited my family in the U.S. For a couple weeks, it took probably 2 to 3 days for me to be able to sleep through the night, to stop looking at my phone incessantly. I would hit my pockets all the time if I didn't have my phone on me. I kept just like hitting the sides where my pockets were. My wife's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I don't even notice. I'm looking for my phone," because I just feel like I have to have it on me at every moment. And I can't not look at it every 30 seconds because there might be a text that I need to respond to. And it took me days to stop hitting my thighs, but it took me months to stop feeling like I had to look at my phone all the time. Even once I quit my job and left Myanmar permanently, it took months and to kind of recalibrate that I wasn't on. And again, I'm coming from like the most privileged position of like, I had a choice to leave and I got to make that choice. I have a great family background. My wife is a therapist, so I come from a lot of strengths, and it was really challenging for me. And so I just take the moment to advocate, for the mental health of those in Myanmar and who have left Myanmar. It is, by all calculations, an absolute mental health crisis for so many, what they're going through right now and what they've been through. And I can see, again, I speak from a position of privilege, and it was taxing and challenging for me. And so for those who don't have access to those same services and support systems and ability to leave in the way that I did, it's a real big issue. But I will say more and more people in Myanmar are both aware of the mental health needs, striving to provide support either through like professionalized services, through verified psychosocial support, or just community well-being and mental health practices that you can do on your own or with a little bit of training. So there are these organizations working on that. And so if anybody's listening and there are those access to those resources are there, and they're there in Myanmar or in Kachin and other local languages as well. So there are opportunities, and it is a growing field for sure that I'm very encouraged by.
I think another thing that stands out in this story, and it's something that we've come back to time and again with so many of our guests, is just that people matter, and who is in the role matters, and that to whatever degree an organization is set up with certain values, with certain protocols, with certain mission or objective, whatever presence that organization or country has. At the end of the day, it does come down to who those people are and what they decide to do, what risks they decide to take, and how they choose to engage in those critical times. And I think that this is yet another story that really just highlights how important it is which individuals are in those roles. And of course there's a wider relationship. Individuals don't come from nowhere. They come from the society or the organizational culture that they're brought into. But at the end of the day, those individuals really do matter, and the choices they make matter. And then as we move to close this conversation, we're talking some years removed from all these incidences that you're describing. It's been nearly 5 years, and this conflict is still not showing any signs of slowing down. Even if it's not covered the way that others are, there is absolute hell, nightmares that are still happening for large portions of the population. If it's not active conflict, then you're looking at food insecurity, or limited opportunities for travel, for jobs. Economy is down, et cetera, et cetera. There are very serious problems that are still occurring across the country. And so I don't know to what degree you're still involved in Myanmar issues professionally now that you've left your position in government. I'm sure personally you're still following and engaged in the news, as well as the connections that you have. So I just invite you to share any thoughts that you have as we're approaching this half decade grim anniversary of this ongoing conflict that's still continuing.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And, I've been very lucky. Even when I left my role in the government, I was able to maintain in my new job and position. I was able to continue to work with a number of civil society organizations doing really impactful work in education and dialogue and peace building, which is so powerful to see people, working on those things through these crises. And obviously I maintain a number of personal relationships and other kind of commitments to organizations and individuals in the country. And I want to just stay as engaged as I can, because I am still hopeful. I don't think this is going to get fixed quick. And I'm very saddened by the state of global affairs and how that pushes Myanmar down the list of priorities. And that is just the reality right now. And I don't see that changing anytime in the next couple of years. But I look at the resilience that the people in Myanmar have, and how much they were able to do in the brief period of freedom that they had. And in that sense, most of the people in Myanmar were coming from a place of no real active knowledge of a free and open society and a democratic norms. And they were able to embrace that so quickly and move towards it so quickly. Now you're coming from a foundation of people know what that is, have experienced it, have lived it, have worked it, and are fighting for it so diligently, that when that day comes, and it will come, I think there's going to be so much growth and opportunity in the country. And I'm trying to, in my sadder moments, when I see the news reports and, watch the devastation of the earthquake combined with new bombings from the military, I am encouraged that there are so many people that are going to bring so many talents and amazing abilities into the country when that opportunity arises, that I hope to continue to be a part of that. I think the most important thing right now is figuring out how to create stronger unity and coordination mechanisms between the various EAOs, civil society, CNPH, all the different groups that have stake in the country. I think we're coming to a real reckoning moment. I think these national elections that the government is going to push are going to be an opportunity for the opposition to demonstrate unity and to demonstrate a real alternative to what are obviously fake and non-important elections that the junta will run. So how they respond to those and what they demonstrate, not just to the rest of the world, but probably more importantly to the people of Myanmar, I think will really go a long way in demonstrating how quickly we can get to a better result and how positive that future is. Because there is an opportunity for real juxtaposition between what the military is offering and what the opposition's offering when these elections come. And I hope that there are some real solid thoughts and ideas for how to do that within the Myanmar community, and hopefully that myself and others in the international community can play a role in. Just a heartfelt thanks to like all of the partners and organizations in Myanmar that I've worked with, because I really appreciate getting a chance to have this voice and to share these thoughts. But it's really all of them and the work that they've done at great risk that I've benefited from, both professionally and as a person, to really see what it's like to really give yourself to a cause and your country and your people. And so I just want to say thank you to all of them for allowing me to be a part of the journey, and hope I can continue to play a role.
Thank you for being a part of this conversation and standing in solidarity with the people and the stories shared here. At Insight Myanmar Podcast, solidarity is not just a word. It's the foundation of everything we do. Each voice we amplify and every story we share represents a call to stand together with those in Myanmar. And so it is through the act of listening, reflecting, and engaging that you become part of this collective effort to uphold dignity, amplify truth, and stand firm for what matters. And I should also add that all of this work is only made possible because of listeners like you who have chosen to offer a contribution. Every donation is an act of standing together, of refusing to turn away, and of reinforcing the bonds that connect us across borders and experiences. If you believe in the power of solidarity and the importance of sharing these stories, we invite you to join us by making a donation. Your support helps us to keep this platform alive and ensure that those voices continue to be heard. Visit insightmyanmar.org/donation to join us in standing with Myanmar.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam